Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joined up. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, I suppose I better cue that theme tune. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 132 with debut novelist Susannah Dickey. We talk everything from short stories and poetry to second-person POV and Riders on the Storm. It'll all make sense when you listen to the conversation, honest. So how's everything going with all of you out there? Is the new normal starting to filter back into your lives? How's it affecting your creative output? I'm still using the recent influx of video production work as an excuse for a lack of words, but that's exactly what it is. It's an excuse. I need to rediscover my mojo and decide which project's going to get my full attention, because my gut tells me I need to complete the changes I started on my novel so that I can get that back out into the world, and that I should do that before I even think about doing anything else. It's just that it seems a bit, about as appealing as watching a box set of Mrs. Brown's Boys. For anyone outside the UK, that's just a terrible TV programme. Side note, I once had to take my in-laws to watch the live show, which was even worse. Anyway, the point is, sometimes you need to eat your greens before you get to start on dessert. I mean, I'm really mixing the metaphors nicely now. But it's time to stop moaning, get to work, and move on. I once talked about this kind of creative baggage with Jessica Abel. She calls them open loops, this idea of unfinished stuff sort of hanging around, draining your creative batteries and making it harder to achieve anything. And if you missed that episode, you can find that in the archives. It's episode 103 to be precise. So can anyone else relate to this? Do you have problems with starting too many projects or putting off the heavy lifting, yet another metaphor, for another day that never comes? Well, let me know, because I want to know that I'm not going nuts. And get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing Wayne at waynekellywrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, I'll stop moaning. Let's get on with today's interview with Susannah Dickey. So Susannah grew up in Derry and now lives in Belfast. She's the author of 2 poetry pamphlets, I Had Some Very Slight Concerns in 2017 and Genuine Human Values 2018. Her poetry's been published in loads of places, including Ambit, the White Review, Ireland Review and Magma. In 2018, she was shortlisted for the White Review Short Story Prize, and in 2017, she was the winner of the inaugural Verve Poetry Festival competition. Her debut novel, Tennis Lessons, is out right now. So here's our Skype chat recorded just a few days ago. Okay, Susie, thanks very much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. I really appreciate it. So why don't you just start off just telling us whereabouts you're actually speaking from and give us a sense of how things are going on the eve of your debut novel coming out.
So I'm speaking to you from Belfast, which is where I live. I live alone. I guess in the run-up to the novel coming out, it's one of those things, because of the nature of how the world is right now. I almost kind of keep forgetting that it's happening.
Yeah, sure.
I got a message from a friend this morning with a screenshot of an email saying, "Oh, your order is on its way," and it was tennis lessons, and I thought, oh no.
Brilliant, it's real.
Oh no, they're going out and I'll have to answer to what I've done.
Well, why don't you start off by telling us about your book, Tennis Lessons?
So Tennis Lessons is it's a take on the Bildungsroman format, which kind of translates to mean formation novel. It's kind of more often referred to as a coming of age story. And it follows an unnamed female protagonist from the age of 3 to 28. And it's in these little short vignettes stopping in at every year in her life at moments that somehow shape who she winds up being as a person. And then there's a section in the middle that hones in on one day when she's 17, and you see how certain events are responsible for how she behaves on that one day. It's a slightly erratic, chaotic maelstrom of a day, and you come to see why she's behaving in the way that she is. And then following on from that, you see how that one day goes on to shape the subsequent years of her life.
Brilliant. So you've got all these fragments that kind of come together, you say, as they sort of coalesce into this narrative. So where did the original idea come from? Was it always going to be a novel, or was it one of those things where you started out with a little idea and it grew from there?
Well, it began as a short story. Its initial permutation was a short story written about this slightly idiosyncratic teenage girl who has a really bad day. And something about the writing of her, because she, like I said, she's slightly idiosyncratic. She has these kind of pervasive, monstrous thoughts. She has this alienation with herself, with her body. She views herself as this kind of monster. And I find her so compelling to write. I thought, because to be completely honest, all her worst thoughts are probably the logical conclusion of some of my thoughts.
Of course, yeah.
The worst possible iteration of me. But I find, a real joy in writing her. And I thought, maybe this has the potential to be something much bigger. I want to spend more time with this person.
It was kind of fun to put that kind of costume on, if you like.
Exactly. There was a real kind of catharsis in it because, she's not necessarily joyful or fun, but there was just a real
She gets away with things that you couldn't, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or maybe you can. Who knows? Well, and the book's written in second person, which is really effective, but it's not a POV that you see too often in mainstream fiction. And having tried it myself, a couple of times for like flash fiction and different bits and pieces in the past, I know that it's also can be really tricky to write. So kind of what made you choose that approach for the book? Was it even a conscious decision when you first started?
I tried first and third person and they didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are certain pieces of writing that I return to again and again that are written in the second person. So Laurie Moore has some short stories. There's one in particular called How to Be the Other Woman. Joyce Carol Oates has a novel called Rape, a Love Story.
Mm-hmm.
And large proportions of it are written in the second person. And it just seemed to me that this was the right way to approach this character and to approach the kind of subject matters I wanted to address. I'm really fascinated by the second person as a device, mm-hmm. because it's so much more kind of illusory than first or third person. Like it takes the protagonist and places them at a position of removal, and it takes the reader and puts them at a position of kind of uncomfortable closeness. The reader is always kind of having to actively reject or accept their part in the story.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
That felt really right to me. And because, the novel looks at subject matters like sexual trauma and body dysmorphia.
That disassociation kind of thing.
Exactly. Like, this is a character who doesn't want to be herself. Mm-hmm. She doesn't recognize her thoughts. Sometimes she doesn't recognize her body. Sometimes she has this real alienation from herself, and just the constant repetition of that you seemed the only like effective way of writing her.
I mean, I've only recently just got a copy of the book, and so I'm quite early on. But yeah, but I think the kind of way that I saw it when I was reading it, and the thing that kind of I really related to, was that idea about when you think back yourself to when you think about when I was 5 or when I was 10 or whatever it was, and this idea that you're like a different person. Then you were a different person, you're a different version of you. So it kind of, for me, it really works because of that, because you're talking about this person as, you know, you do this, you do that, so it is you, but you're almost referring it to it as somebody else, which I found that really works really well.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's really interesting you say that, because I think that's spot on. You know, this is a person who I think would like to be something different, and struggles to accept who she is and who she has been. So there's always this slight disconnect between herself and her past and her present.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think the you was a really good way of trying to portray that.
Absolutely. And I think, maybe I'm on my own in this, but have you ever yourself thought back to things that have happened when you were younger and thought almost like that's like a different person? I can't really believe that it was me that was doing that, or, you know, because memory is funny anyway, isn't it? That you sort of play tricks on yourself when you remember things anyway. You often remember it slightly differently, or you perceive it, you project onto it sort of how you are now, or whatever. So that it kind of worked for me. It worked, that had that extra thing with it as well. That's why it kind of, you know, looking back on it, it's almost like, well, that it is me, but it's not me. It's like a different version of me, because I hadn't experienced what I've experienced now. I haven't got the maturity or whatever it happens to be in that moment.
Yes. I mean, memory is so kind of strange anyway, and how it works. It's so like mutable and fallible, and we're making these conscious decisions in terms of what we choose to carry with us, and it's so liable to change and shift as we focus on it and we go through it in our head over and over again. It alters. And you know, I do look back on moments in my life, and it's weird, in the nature of memory, I'm almost standing outside of myself, watching myself behave in certain situations, and that alienation of myself with my past self is really awful.
Yeah, I know exactly where you're coming from, though. And sometimes, I mean, the odd occasion that you see some old footage or something, if you've got like a family, and it's almost so, it's strange. It is like, well, that's a different person, but it's not. It's me. It's just that strange idea. So in the same way that your book does, let's kind of go back to the beginning. So what's your earliest memory of writing in general? How did you find your way into it?
Oh, wow. I mean, I came to writing quite late, I think, in comparison to some people. It wasn't an aspiration that I ever really had. Not because, you know, I've always loved reading. I was a voracious reader from a very young age, but writing just didn't seem like an avenue that was accessible to me, or possible, or just even within the realms of realistic. But I was at Queen's doing English literature. And as part of our first year, there was a mandatory module in creative writing. And I wrote some poems which were so bad. Just truly execrable poems. Like I should have either, I don't know what they should have done to me, thrown me in a volcano right there. It was crime against the written word. But I really enjoyed doing it.
Yeah.
And so I decided to switch to English with creative writing. And my focus was on poetry for a few years. Tennis Lessons was the first long form piece of fiction I've ever attempted, which might speak to why it probably has so many conceptual flaws.
Well, I've got massive respect for poets, because it's just something that I'm terrible at. I write songs, which is like the lazy man's version of poetry, because you can just cheat and you can mess around with meter, and you can just generally just do all the things that you're not supposed to do when you write a proper poem. So I've got massive respect for anybody that can do it. So. And you had quite a lot of success. You've been published quite a few places for your poetry and stuff, and I know you've had you mentioned short stories and things like that. So but what do you think you kind of took from, do you think there are lessons that you learnt from your poetry that you took into writing prose? Because obviously poetry has to be so disciplined and so tightly written.
I definitely think one influences the other in a really quite noticeable way for me. The kind of the poems that the form of poetry that I first became really enthused by was actually prose poetry, which is a really, really strange form in that it kind of straddles the two and not really necessarily doing what either form should do, but it's this really interesting form that I really took to because of how it encouraged these manipulations of narrative expectation and how you could play with linguistic ambiguities, but you didn't need to do plot or character development like with prose, and you didn't have to conform to meter or maybe conventions of lyric like I saw you have to do with maybe other types of poetry. So that form I think really influences my prose, which might be why my prose is so plotless. But I think a really interesting thing for me in terms of transitioning from poetry to prose was the idea of like refrains. Because I'm really interested in linearity and narrative, and I think I'm becoming increasingly attuned to how a voice functions in a piece of writing beyond just I'm being told something by this piece of work. Like things like how refrains and descriptors and associative language work, because it ties in again with memory. You can see how a character relates things through these like repetitions of descriptors and the associations they're making. Like in The English Patient, Michael Ondaatje has these phrases that recur again and again. He loves the word palanquin and trompe l'oeil, that method of painting. And those two things come up again and again and again in the book, and it's really strange. And I think that's something that kind of has its roots in like Greek literature. So I think in the Odyssey, Homer has these recurring descriptors and phrases, and it just serves to remind you someone is telling this. There is a narrator at play here, however invisible, and the understanding of the world that we're gaining is their perception of it.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, this comes up quite a lot when I chat to people, and particularly when I've spoken to people like agents and publishers and different things, and you're sort of saying, well, what did you see in this book, or why did you keep reading it, or why did you take the author on, or whatever it is. And they always struggle to articulate it, but it's this thing about voice again, and it's quite hard to put your hands on sometimes. I mean, it sounds from what you've said, you've studied quite a lot of stuff and you've picked out, very specific things that you can probably come back to, but often it's not always that easy to do that, because it's just this, as you say, you get this sense from the narrator. You don't necessarily have to know who they are, but you get this sense, their rhythm, their length of the sentences and everything else, and that's kind of where the voice kind of builds up, isn't it? And I suppose it's how consciously or not you kind of work to include that when you're writing something, how much you focus on that, whether it's subconscious or conscious. But it sounds like for you it's quite a conscious thing.
Yeah, because I think you're absolutely right in that it can be so kind of nebulous trying to identify what it is about a piece of writing that speaks to you and appeals to you. But But I think, when I'm, because it's something that I think I'm drawn to in other people's work, I maybe have a heightened awareness and focus on it. But I think, when I'm writing, I don't really kind of subscribe to the idea that writing, you're either having a good day or you're not. Either the impulse is there or it's not. I mean, there are days when, your thoughts seem to come more naturally. Your like synapses feel a bit sort of buoyant and pulsier and livelier. It all feels much more easy. But on the days when it's not like that, it can still happen. You just have to like work at it. And how I kind of try to approach it is to ask myself, where is the strange or idiosyncratic or interesting to be found in this very kind of quotidian item or experience? Like, how can I siphon beauty from this very normal thing? And, the writers that I love are ones who can just write about something so commonplace, but imbue it with this strangeness or weirdness or this
poetry.
This unusual association, like how they can intuit the counterintuitive. And I think that's something that you can see happening with these kind of refrains and very specific linguistic choices.
So when you actually sat down to, when you sort of realised, you started writing this, what you thought was initially a short story, and then at some point you thought, hang on, there's legs in this and I'm going to write a novel. Tell me about that. How did that feel? Was it kind of a eureka moment, or did you just kind of keep going and think, hang on, this is getting longer and longer and longer and it's going to be a novel? How did the book sort of, did you was a lot of it made in the edit? Well, often is anyway, but like, did you think much about the structure as you were going along? How did that sort of pan out?
I mean, I think I was quite lucky in that. So I started writing it in January 2016. Mm-hmm. And really the only reason I did was, so I'd written the short story and I'd sent it to a friend of mine, and they said, you should do this, you should make this into a novel. And I think I was lucky in that I knew so little about what writing a novel involved. I knew so little.
You weren't scared away.
Exactly. I think if I'd had just like a bare minimum of insight, I wouldn't even have attempted it. But I didn't have much to do. I wasn't very busy. I had some time, and I had this really beautiful, blissful ignorance. So I just sat down and just started writing, and it was a shambles. The first draft wasn't a novel. It was just a bit of writing that kept going. It was all over the place. And also at the time I was trying to do this really, because it's the second person, which is a voice people can find quite off-putting. But in its first permutation, I decided to supplement that by also doing this like really, really experimental, convoluted structure with flashbacks and flash forwards, and it was a chore to read it. And then it was suggested to me in a real, moment of radical thinking. What if you just wrote this in the order in which it happens?
It's crazy, but it might just work.
Like, what? Get out of here!
Do you know nothing about me? Yeah.
And it honestly, it's because the initial writing had been so laborious and I had done this mad structure. It took next to no time to rewrite it with some semblance of linearity, and the improvement to it was insane.
You're like, you can actually read it now.
Yeah, this is actually something someone might want to read and could actually conceivably enjoy. Like, who'd have thought?
So when did you think, or when did you consider the idea of like, well, actually I'd like to try and get this published or whatever? What was your path to publication?
So following on from my undergrad, I did a master's in creative writing at Goldsmiths.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was there, I wrote another short story. And again, I'd just been sitting on the novel and not really paying it a huge amount of attention at that time because, you know, I was doing a lot of poetry at the time. I was having a go at short stories again. And this one short story I'd written got shortlisted for a short story prize in London. And one of the judges of that prize is a woman called Sophie Scard, who is an agent at United Agents. And she said, I didn't end up winning the short story prize. And, you know, I threw a real tantrum about it.
Brilliant.
I'm an idiot.
You're a rock and roll writer. Did you storm out or anything? That would have been great.
I did not storm out. I spent a very long period of time in a very dark toilet cubicle, just ruminating furiously, doing some self-flagellation. And Sophie said, you wrote this story. I really enjoyed it. Do you have anything else? And I was like, well, funnily enough, I wrote a novel for no reason. And she said, great, send it to me. And I did. And that was when it was still in its kind of chaotic maelstrom of a non-linear, you know, ball of wool thing. But she really liked the writing, and it was her who suggested, you know, crazy thought.
The linear structure.
Yeah, try linear. And yeah, we did that. And then she said, you know, I think this is ready to go out. And she sent it out, and very fortuitously, someone wanted it.
Well, not fortuitously. Obviously, it's because it was good. But so when you did that, I mean, did you then think, well, this is it now? This is me. I'm a novelist, and I'm going to try. Have you tried to write another novel, or are you working on something else?
Yeah. So I've just finished very recently the first draft of my next novel. And I think, you know, it's the whole process of doing that has been considerably less torturous, because, you know, I know kind of what works now. I know what I'm good at, and I'm no longer trying to reinvent the novel. I mean, you know, the novel's fine, the novel's lovely. It doesn't need me to fix it.
What do you think? I mean, apart from obviously the thing about the linear structure and all that kind of stuff, what do you think you actually learnt from tennis lessons to the next novel? I mean, has it changed how are you kind of finding that you're developing like a set approach now? Did you plan the second novel a bit more, or did you do it the same in terms of you just went with it? How did things change as regards that?
I think it was beneficial to, for starters, I think the editorial process of working on tennis lessons with editors has given me a much greater insight into how characters work. And, you know, maybe it was to my detriment from going from poetry to prose. I think it was, you know, to my benefit in terms of how I use language and how I write observations. But I had never really had to grapple or think about what a plot should do and what a character should do. And, you know, I'm not someone who is a huge proponent of a big arc of dramatic character development. Because I mean, I spend so much of my life stagnating. Why shouldn't my characters get to as well? But I do think they have to demonstrate at least a little bit of change. They need to do something.
Have a bit of agency, yeah.
Yeah, you can't have 60,000 words of just thinking. And so I think that was really learning that and seeing how the protagonist of tennis lessons changed over the course of the editorial process, how, you know, what she does and how she moves through the world got fine-tuned. That I think has been hugely beneficial to me in writing a second one. And you know, I didn't sit down with a set prescribed plan, but I knew what I wanted the novel to be, and I knew I had these moments that had to happen on which to hang the whole kind of structure and plot. So the whole process felt much more streamlined. I mean, again, it's only a first draft and it's probably completely garbage, but it felt certainly less painful than the first time.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. And what would you say was, in general, what would you say was the hardest part of writing Tennis Lessons, and how did you overcome that?
What was the hardest part? I think because, I just sort of, I threw myself into it and just decided I want to write this life, but I had so little initial conception of what this life even was really going to be, and what I needed to happen. I had these certain events that I was trying to write towards, but I'd set myself this kind of mammoth Herculean task of trying to write 25 years of a life, and it's like, you need more than one event 25 years of a life.
Yeah.
And it was just having to build that network around her, because I think sometimes in novels, you gain an intimacy with the protagonist by how their world is framed. The world exists beyond them,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're situated within it. But in Tennis Lessons, it's the inverse of that. The intimacy works from the inside out. We never see anything with any objectivity. It's the world doesn't exist beyond how she sees it. But I realized, that she needs to have a network of characters and just stuff around her that she can be growing in reaction to and living with and interacting with. It's not enough to just have a character. There needs to be a world there also. And I think that was what I struggled with in Tennis Lessons. Was it just took a very long time to construct that world.
And so on the back of that, when you approached your next novel, was that sort of in the back of your mind when you kicked this off? Did you think, well, I'm going to spend a bit more time on that at the beginning, or?
Yeah, so in this one, it focuses on two protagonists and how they wind up in a slightly circuitous, odd way, how they wind up interacting with each other. But before I wrote anything, I thought, who are these people beyond themselves? Because that's gonna form the basis for writing them, as opposed to just trying to write them in isolation.
Yeah. And so, and when you're doing that, when you're kind of rounding out characters or anything, are there any particular exercises or anything that you do in particular? I know, like, some people, that they do things like, I've heard things like they'll interview the character, or they'll write the character a letter, or they'll do something that's kind of outside the world of the novel. Have you ever tried any of that stuff? When you've stuck, or do you literally just make notes and then just crack on with the prose?
Yeah, no, I've never really. That's actually a really interesting idea. Because sometimes those writing exercises and things like that, they'd be things I'd kind of do with poetry.
Mm-hmm.
If I was struggling, I'd try an ekphrasis, where I would look at a painting and try and imbue it with a kind of certain poetic narrative, or I would write a poem in response to another pre-existing poem.
Mm-hmm.
Fiction, I've never done that so much, although actually in the second novel, so the one that I'm writing at the minute, I knew that at one point I wanted there to be a very kind of intimate writing of last year's Wimbledon final.
Right. The tennis thing's coming through again, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know why I've decided that this is my thing. I've decided that I want two things to recur in everything I ever write. And the two things are tennis and the song Riders on the Storm by The Doors.
Yeah.
Which I think gets mentioned in Tennis Lessons 8 times.
So that's going to be your thing.
Yeah, yeah. I want to be tennis laureate.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a kind of almost ekphrasis exercise. I was watching this tennis match, and then I was watching it as myself, but then I was watching it as how I thought a character might watch it. And in the scene, the character is watching it with her mother. And then I was like, oh well, how might these characters react to this bit in a match? How might this point set off a certain slightly lateral conversation between the two of them, and so on. So that was the first time I'd ever really done anything like that with fiction. But I really, really enjoyed doing it. Would you say I'll send the novel to my editors and they'll say we have to cut this whole thing about this?
No, I think that's a good thing. It's a good exercise to do with scripts as well. When you're doing dramatic writing, it's quite a good. It can be really effective if you if you put two characters in a situation or give them something other to discuss that's not what the actual central conflict is actually about or what their actual problem is, but then use that as a vehicle to explore it. I think that's really interesting and can often be funny as well, or sad or whatever, but it can be quite a powerful way to do it, can't it?
Yeah, because I guess you want to write these characters that are real people. They don't just have this singularity of thought. They're experiencing the world beyond just the main plot points, and I think it can be really beneficial in just injecting them with nuance and making them real is exploring just how they might discuss or react to very kind of commonplace situations beyond what it is the novel is actually about. Absolutely,
yeah. So, obviously, you've kind of gone down the route of, you've done your a master's and all the other different bits and pieces. So you've got like a formal education in writing. But what would you say has been, along the way, what would you say has been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given?
Best piece of advice I've been given. This is probably so obvious and so not interesting, but just reading. Like, reading is the best thing you can do for your writing.
Yeah.
Read everyone, read the writers whose work might seem, so counterintuitive and incompatible with your own, and look at what they're doing and think about it.
I think that's the key there. The second part of it, isn't it? Is the thinking about it, because it's easy to just read things or watch TV or whatever, but to actually stop and try and, even if you can't actually quite work out what they're doing, if you try to work out what they're doing, sometimes it can lead you somewhere else, and you tend to pick up things, don't you, along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would be so kind of reticent to ever give advice, because I think we base the kind of validity of advice on how much success the person has had, as opposed to how good the advice actually is.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
And I would definitely say that my approach sometimes to writing is punishing, and it's not something that I would recommend that anyone do. But yeah, just like you just said, just thinking and grappling with what pieces of writing are doing. Just because it's sometimes you just have to work your imagination a bit harder. Don't expect nuanced and insightful thoughts to just appear like fairies. You have to actually work a bit hard to get there.
Yeah, I think it's why the editing part of the novel is the hardest, from the point of view of the hardest thinking part of the novel, because often when you're writing a story, especially if you've just got an idea and you just kind of go with it and it kind of grows out of that or whatever, you just almost follow it where it goes and you follow your characters and everything else. And then I know everyone's different, but at least for me, when you get to the editing part, that's when the real thinking begins, because obviously in your case with your first draft, you had the whole structural thing as well, but you were basically trying to shape what you had, and you're trying to find the themes, and you're trying to find, it's almost like that's when you find out what it means, isn't it? Is that whole thing is Really that's when you find out what it means, is when you do the second draft, or when you start the edit and you actually start looking at it, and that's when you sort of discover what it is that you've actually written, like what it's actually about.
Yeah, because I think, when you respond really well to a piece of writing, it's almost like it's colluding with you in some sense. There's something to which you and this piece of writing are privy that maybe someone else isn't privy to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think almost in the first version of writing, as when you're the person writing it, you're not even sure what it is you want to collude with a reader over, what secrets you want your book to have that only like some readers might be capable of unearthing. And I think it becomes apparent to you through editing what those little points of intimacy need to be.
Yeah, and what you need to bring out.
Yeah.
So as we kind of move towards wrapping things up, if you were starting, I mean, I know you're very early on in your journey and you're starting out and you're debut novelist and everything, but if you were starting again tomorrow as a new writer, or maybe, you're early teens or whatever when you first getting into doing a bit of writing, what, if anything, would you do differently, or what would you go back and tell your younger self to make your life a bit easier, a bit more less stressful?
I think one, I think not that I would ever encourage anyone to temper their ambition, but I do think I shot myself in the foot in the earliest stages by trying to do something so kind of radically different, and I I think maybe the novel benefited from that because maybe I picked out moments and I was able to weave themes through it that I might not have otherwise done. But I definitely think if I had just sat down and thought a little bit more prior to commencing writing about what it was I actually wanted to write, as opposed to just saying, right, I'm gonna get 60,000 words out. Here we go. Let's dive in. Just a cursory moment of reflection on what it was I actually wanted to do, I think would have helped me a lot. I would also, I think I can be very, very self-punitive in how in what I view myself to, in what I think I need to have achieved by certain points.
Yeah.
As time goes on, I'm becoming very aggressively ambitious and competitive, not so much with other people, but with myself.
Yeah.
To the point where if I see myself to not be achieving much, it doesn't even push me to work a bit harder. I just sit and ruminate
Fume. Yeah.
and just be a complete, pain in the arse. And I think that can really sabotage yourself in a way that's not helpful. So yeah, I think if I could go back and fix myself in some small way, it would be one, to think more about the writing, and two, think less about achievement.
Yeah. Well, I think like with the example that you're giving with tennis lessons, though, I think it's one of those things. It's like, yes, it probably meant that it took, a lot longer, and it was kind of very tricky to kind of untangle it all and put it in the way that you wanted to do it. But then there's another argument for saying that was just part of the journey, and if you hadn't done it that way, then you wouldn't have ended up with the novel that you've got. So it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think that because it's like when I write things, I don't tend to heavily plot, pre-plot things. I just tend to, I've got a vague idea and then off I go. But the problem with that is that you'll often go down loads of dead ends and you'll end up in a cul-de-sac and you can't get your way out of it, or it doesn't make sense, or, and then you've got the whole thing when you get to the edit, you then realise, well, I've wasted, thousands of words there where that's not going anywhere. I need to cut that now, and we're going to go back down this, and it's frustrating. And I've kind of grappled with it where I'm like, well, next time I'm going to sit down and I'm really going to plan everything out, and make sure I know. But it doesn't work for me, and I think it is just part of the journey.
Yeah.
I think it's because it's like years ago I had an artist did a portrait of my daughter. And I'd never, ever been able to do that. Basically, I worked with an artist. I made a little film about him, and I asked him if he'd be up for doing this if I paid him to do this portrait or whatever. So I sent him a photograph, and he sent me the first thing, and I sort of thought, well, it's not quite right, and I felt really bad about going back. But he was like, no, this is part of the process. It's never exactly how you want it the first time. So you need to give me feedback. That's fine. And then I'll work on it a bit more, and then you can give me a bit more feedback. And he was absolutely fine with it. It's like, this is how you do it. This is how I create the portrait that you want. This is just part of it. And I think sometimes with writing, I think you're right. I think we're a bit hard on ourselves, and we think, we've kind of got to just vomit out this perfect draft first time.
Yeah, like I think it's really easy to kind of rue those moments where you have to sacrifice a huge amount of work. But I guess, it's just about kind of recalibrating your thoughts to think, well, this isn't ultimately going to be anything, but that doesn't mean it was a waste of time.
No, because it's how you got there, isn't it? It's basically how you reach. It's, I know it's become the big cliche, the journey thing, but I think it is. It's just part of how you got to where you needed to be.
Yes, exactly.
So, okay. So, yeah, just before we go, so I know you probably can't, you've literally, your debut novel's about to come out, so you're not going to talk loads about your second novel, or at least telling us exactly what it's about and all that kind of thing. But can you just give us a sense of like what's coming up next? Obviously tell us where the novel is and when it comes out, and just where people can find out more about you online.
Okay, so Tennis Lessons comes out next Thursday, the 16th of July. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, where I'm a bit irritating, or you can find me on Instagram, where I'm a bit more irritating. The second novel, it's still in its infancy, but it's going to do a sort of dual narrative thing. It's going to focus on two protagonists split down the middle, and it's going to be looking at things like, grief and obsession, but also tennis.
I was going to say, yeah. And Riders on the Storm hopefully will pop up in there somewhere.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's been great talking to you, Susannah. I really appreciate it. So for now, thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Joined Up Writing.
Okay, thanks again to Susannah Dickey, and I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get them from to have that podcast downloaded automatically every time. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever else, because it really helps others to find the show, or you can, just tell a friend. So next week I'm talking to crime writer Christopher Fowler. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.